In the American Mafia, power was usually paid for in blood. Most bosses rose with a roar and fell with a bullet, but while his rivals were being fitted for handcuffs or coffins, one man ruled the New York underworld for decades without ever spending a day behind bars. His name was Carlo Gambino. He was the Don of Dons, the most feared man in the five families. Yet, he walked the streets of Brooklyn like a quiet grandfather. He didn't just rule the mafia, he mastered the art of being invisible. The real story isn't the crimes he committed, it's how he became the most powerful man in America. By becoming a ghost. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in the city of Palermo, on the island of Sicily. At the time, Sicily was a place where poverty, corruption, and secret criminal societies were deeply intertwined with everyday life. Long before Gambino was born, the island had already become the birthplace of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, the Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra. For many families in Palermo, the Mafia was not just a criminal organization, it was a system of protection, loyalty, and power. And Carlo Gambino was born directly into that world. His family had strong ties to the Sicilian Mafia. Several of his relatives were believed to be connected to local mafia clans that controlled neighborhoods, businesses, and even political influence. From a young age, Gambino grew up surrounded by men who lived by the strict codes of secrecy, loyalty, and respect that defined Cosa Nostra. In that environment, crime was not always seen as something unusual. Instead, it was often viewed as a path to survival, status, and power. As a young boy, Gambino learned the unwritten rules of the mafia world. Never betray your family, never speak to the authorities, and always respect the hierarchy of power. These values would shape the way he operated for the rest of his life. But while Sicily shaped Gambino's early identity, his real opportunities would emerge thousands of miles away. In the early 20th century, millions of Italians were immigrating to the United States, searching for a better life. At the same time, America itself was changing. Cities like New York were growing rapidly, filled with immigrants trying to build new futures. By the 1920s, organized crime was beginning to take root in American cities. Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs were forming powerful criminal networks that controlled gambling, smuggling, and protection rackets. In 1921, at just 19 years old, Carlo Gambino illegally entered the United States by stowing away on a ship. Like many young Sicilians at the time, he arrived in New York with almost nothing, no money, no status, and no legal identity. But he did arrive with something far more valuable: connections. Within the Italian neighborhoods of New York, the mafia already had strong roots. Sicilian immigrants had begun recreating the same criminal structures that existed back home. For Gambino, entering this world came naturally. Still young but already deeply familiar with the traditions of Cosa Nostra, he quickly found his place within the growing criminal underworld of New York City. And in the decades that followed, the quiet young immigrant from Palermo would rise to become one of the most powerful mafia bosses America had ever seen. When Carlo Gambino arrived in New York in the early 1920s, the city was already transforming into one of the most important battlegrounds for organized crime in the world. America was entering a new and chaotic era. In 1920, the United States government introduced a law that would change the criminal underworld forever. The 18th Amendment made the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal. This period became known as Prohibition. The goal was simple: eliminate alcohol and reduce crime. But the result was the exact opposite. Millions of Americans still wanted to drink. Bars secretly continued to operate. Nightclubs opened hidden back rooms. And suddenly, alcohol became one of the most profitable illegal businesses in the nation. The illegal production and distribution of alcohol quickly turned into a multi-million-dollar industry. Criminal groups began importing whiskey from Canada, producing illegal liquor in hidden distilleries, and distributing it through underground networks of bars and speakeasies. New York City became one of the largest centers of this black market alcohol trade. Powerful gangs fought to control these profitable routes, and violence became common in the streets. Shootings, kidnappings, and assassinations became tools used to eliminate rivals. Within the Italian underworld of New York, two powerful mafia leaders began competing for control. The first was Joe Masseria, a dominant and feared boss who had built a powerful criminal organization across the city. Known as a traditionalist, Masseria believed in the old Sicilian style of mafia leadership: strict loyalty, secrecy, and centralized control. His rival was Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian immigrant who had recently arrived in New York. Maranzano was intelligent, disciplined, and Diaz-Epli rooted in the traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. But unlike Masseria, he had a clear vision for restructuring the American Mafia into a more organized and hierarchical system. As tensions grew between these two powerful figures, the conflict eventually exploded into what would become one of the most important mafia wars in history. It became known as the Castellamarese War. The name came from Castellammare del Golfo, a town in Sicily where many of Maranzano's supporters originated. The war was not just a battle between two men. It was a violent struggle between rival factions of the Italian Mafia, each determined to dominate the criminal underworld of New York. The conflict began around 1930 and quickly turned the city into a battlefield. Gunmen loyal to each side carried out assassinations across New York. Ambushes became common. Gang leaders were hunted down in restaurants, streets, and private homes. Loyalty meant survival, and betrayal meant death. Young gangsters were forced to choose sides. Among them was the ambitious and disciplined Carlo Gambino. Although still relatively young, Gambino had already begun building connections within the Italian criminal networks of Brooklyn. His Sicilian heritage and family ties made it natural for him to align himself with the faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano's organization was made up largely of Sicilian immigrants who shared similar cultural backgrounds and traditions. For Gambino, this faction offered both familiarity and opportunity. By supporting Maranzano, Gambino was joining a group that believed strongly in the traditional values of the Sicilian Mafia: respect for hierarchy, loyalty to leadership, and strict adherence to the code of silence known as omerta. As the war intensified, the violence escalated. Dozens of mobsters were killed as each side attempted to weaken the other. The streets of New York saw an increase in targeted assassinations, and the conflict drew the attention of law enforcement and the public. But behind the violence, the real battle was about power. Who would control the Italian Mafia in America? For Carlo Gambino, the Castellamarese War became an early test of loyalty and survival. By standing with Maranzano's faction, he placed himself within a group that was determined to reshape the structure of organized crime. The war would eventually lead to the fall of Joe Masseria and the temporary rise of Salvatore Maranzano as the most powerful mafia leader in New York. But even more importantly, the conflict would pave the way for a new generation of gangsters, men who would transform the American Mafia into a powerful national organization. And among those rising figures was the quiet, calculating immigrant from Sicily, Carlo Gambino. By 1931, the brutal violence of the Castellamarese War was finally coming to an end. Months of assassinations, betrayals, and street battles had weakened both sides. But in the end, one man emerged victorious: Salvatore Maranzano. With the help of younger gangsters who had secretly turned against Joe Masseria, Maranzano's faction managed to eliminate their rival. In April of 1931, Joe Masseria was assassinated in a Brooklyn restaurant, marking the end of his reign and effectively ending the war. With his biggest enemy gone, Maranzano quickly moved to consolidate power. Soon after the conflict ended, he summoned the leaders of the Italian criminal organizations in New York to a meeting. There he announced a new structure for the American Mafia. Maranzano divided the Mafia into 5 separate families in New York, each led by a boss who controlled his own territory and operations. This structure would later become famously known as the 5 Families. But Maranzano didn't stop there. In a move that would soon create new tensions within the underworld, He declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. In his view, this title placed him above every other mafia leader in America. All bosses, regardless of their family or territory, were expected to recognize his ultimate authority. To some older Sicilian gangsters, this system seemed natural. It reflected the traditional mafia hierarchy that had existed in Sicily for generations. But not everyone agreed. Among the younger generation of gangsters, many believed the old system was outdated and dangerous. They had just survived a devastating war caused by rival bosses fighting for absolute power. Now, Maranzano was recreating the same structure that could lead to another conflict. One man in particular strongly opposed the idea. His name was Lucky Luciano. Luciano was one of the most ambitious and forward-thinking gangsters of his time. Unlike many older mafia leaders, he believed organized crime should operate more like a business than a rigid Sicilian hierarchy. He worked closely with Jewish and Irish criminal groups, building alliances that extended far beyond traditional mafia boundaries. Luciano had helped Maranzano defeat Joe Masseria, but once Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, Luciano began to see him as a threat. Rumors soon spread that Maranzano was planning to eliminate the younger gangsters who had grown too powerful during the war, including Luciano himself. Luciano decided to act first. In September 1931, only months after declaring himself the boss of bosses, Salvatore Maranzano was assassinated in his office in Manhattan. According to most accounts, a group of gunmen posing as government agents entered the building, disarmed Maranzano's guards, and killed him inside his own headquarters. With Maranzano gone, Luciano seized the opportunity to reshape the entire structure of the mafia. Instead of creating another supreme boss, Luciano introduced a new system designed to prevent future wars between powerful families. He established what became known as the Commission. The Commission functioned like a governing council for the American Mafia. Rather than having one leader above everyone else, the bosses of the major crime families would meet to resolve disputes, approve major decisions, and maintain balance within the underworld. It was, in many ways, the birth of the modern American Mafia. For rising gangsters like Carlo Gambino, this new system created opportunity. Gambino had supported Maranzano during the war, but he was also smart enough to understand the changing dynamics of power. As Luciano and his allies began reorganizing the mafia, Gambino quietly aligned himself with the new leadership structure. He avoided unnecessary conflict, kept a low profile, and focused on strengthening his position within the growing criminal network. This ability to adapt, to survive shifts in power without attracting attention, would become one of Gambino's greatest strengths. While many gangsters rose and fell through violence and ambition, Carlo Gambino began building his reputation in a different way, quietly, carefully, and always watching where the power was moving next. As the American Mafia entered a new era under the system created by Lucky Luciano, younger gangsters began positioning themselves within the reorganized structure of organized crime. For ambitious men like Carlo Gambino, survival was no longer just about loyalty during a war. It was about choosing the right alliances and building relationships with the most powerful figures in the underworld. One of the most important relationships Gambino would develop during this period was with a man who had already earned a terrifying reputation throughout the mafia. His name was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was a Sicilian-born gangster who had immigrated to the United States years earlier. Like Gambino, he had grown up surrounded by the traditions of the old Sicilian mafia. But unlike the quiet and cautious Gambino, Anastasia was known for his ruthless and violent nature. Within organized crime circles, Anastasia earned a chilling nickname, the Lord High Executioner. The name reflected both his reputation and his role within the mafia's enforcement network. Anastasia was believed to be one of the central figures behind a secret group that became known as Murder Inc. Murder Inc. was not a traditional mafia family. Instead, it operated as an organized assassination squad for the American Mafia. The group consisted of professional killers who carried out murders on behalf of various crime bosses across the country. If a mafia leader needed a rival eliminated, a witness silenced, or a traitor punished, the job could be handed over to Murder Inc. The group operated with frightening efficiency. Most of its members were based in Brooklyn and had connections to both Italian and Jewish criminal networks. They used a variety of methods to carry out their killings: guns, knives, ice picks, and even garrotes, often striking quickly and disappearing before authorities could react. Over time, investigators would estimate that Murder Inc. was responsible for hundreds of murders during the 1930s and early 1940s. And Albert Anastasia stood at the center of this deadly operation. For Carlo Gambino, becoming associated with Anastasia was a major turning point in his rise within the mafia. Anastasia was not just feared, he was respected. His connections reached across the major crime families, and his reputation made him one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. By working closely with Anastasia's crew, Gambino gained access to a powerful network within the mafia hierarchy. But Gambino did not become known for violence in the same way Anastasia did. Instead, he observed. He watched how powerful gangsters operated, how decisions were made, and how loyalty and fear were used to maintain control. From Anastasia, Gambino learned several lessons that would shape the way he ran his own organization years later. The first was discipline. In the mafia world, reckless behavior often led to exposure and arrest. Gambino saw how carefully planned operations were far more effective than impulsive violence. The second lesson was strategy. The underworld was filled with ambitious men, and power constantly shifted between rival factions. Surviving in this environment required patience, careful alliances, and the ability to anticipate threats before they emerged. And perhaps the most important lesson Gambino absorbed was the reality of power politics within organized crime. Behind the public image of loyalty and brotherhood, the mafia was constantly shaped by competition and quiet rivalries. Leaders rose and fell based on alliances, influence, and timing. While Anastasia built his reputation through fear and brutality, Gambino began developing a very different approach. He stayed quiet. He avoided unnecessary attention, and he carefully strengthened his poses, hidden within Anastasia's growing power base. Over time, Gambino became one of Anastasia's most trusted associates. Within the mafia hierarchy, he was seen as disciplined, reliable, and loyal, qualities that allowed him to rise steadily through the ranks. Few people in the underworld realized it at the time, but the quiet Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in New York with almost nothing was slowly positioning himself closer and closer to real power. And in the years ahead, the fate of Albert Anastasia would play a decisive role in Carlo Gambino's rise to the top of the American Mafia. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia had become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the American Mafia. After years of violence and influence, he had risen to become the boss of one of New York's major crime families. His reputation as the Lord High Executioner followed him everywhere. But power in the mafia rarely remained stable for long. Behind the scenes, tensions were quietly building. Many mob leaders had begun to see Anastasia as unpredictable and dangerous. His violent reputation had drawn too much attention from law enforcement, and some bosses believed his actions threatened the stability of the entire mafia structure. In the secret world of organized crime, when a boss becomes a problem, the solution is often simple: remove him. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia followed his usual routine in Manhattan. He entered the Park Sheraton Hotel, where he often went for a shave and haircut at the hotel's barbershop. The atmosphere inside was calm and ordinary. Anastasia settled into the barber's chair, relaxing as the barber prepared the hot towels and shaving cream. Few people inside the shop had any idea that they were about to witness one of the most infamous assassinations in mafia history. As Anastasia sat facing the large mirror in front of him, two men suddenly entered the barbershop. Witnesses later described them as wearing coats and hats, their identities hidden as they moved quickly through the room. Within seconds, they approached Anastasia. Before anyone could react, the gunmen pulled out their weapons. Gunshots exploded inside the quiet barbershop. Anastasia tried to rise from the chair, but the attackers fired repeatedly. Bullets struck him multiple times, and his body collapsed onto the floor. But the attackers were too fast. Within moments, the powerful mafia boss lay dead on the barbershop floor. The gunmen quickly fled the scene, disappearing into the streets of Manhattan before police could arrive. The assassination shocked both the public and the criminal underworld. Killing a mafia boss in such a public place was a bold and dangerous act. It sent a clear message that power within the mafia was shifting. At that moment, the balance of power in the mafia changed forever. With Anastasia gone, a vacuum had suddenly opened at the top of one of New York's most powerful crime families. The question now was simple: who would take control? Almost immediately, suspicions began circulating within the mafia world about who might have been responsible for orchestrating the assassination. Major power shifts rarely happened without careful planning, and many believed the killing had been approved by powerful figures within the Mafia Commission. Among the names quietly mentioned was Carlo Gambino. At the time, Gambino had already established himself as one of Anastasia's trusted associates, but he was also known for his patience and political intelligence. Unlike Anastasia, Gambino preferred to operate behind the scenes, building alliances and avoiding unnecessary attention. Some historians believe Gambino worked with other mafia leaders who were growing uneasy with Anastasia's leadership. By removing the violent boss, they could replace him with someone more controlled and strategic. Whether Gambino personally planned the assassination or simply benefited from it remains a subject of debate. But one fact is certain. After the death of Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino would soon step forward to take control of the organization. And under his leadership, the family would grow into one of the most powerful criminal empires in American history. The assassination of Albert Anastasia in 1957 created a sudden and powerful shift inside the American Mafia. When a boss was removed, the next leader was rarely chosen by chance. Behind the scenes, the Mafia Commission, the governing council of the major crime families, carefully watched how power was redistributed. In the days following Anastasia's death, attention quickly turned to one man who had quietly built influence within the organization for years: Carlo Gambino. Unlike many gangsters of his era, Gambino had never tried to dominate through violence or public displays of power. He avoided attention, kept a low profile, and carefully strengthened relationships within the mafia hierarchy. This quiet strategy now worked in his favor. With the approval of powerful mafia leaders, Carlo Gambino was elevated to the position of boss. The crime family that Anastasia once led soon became known by a new name, the Gambino crime family. Under Gambino's leadership, the organization began to transform. Where Anastasia had ruled through fear and brutality, Gambino preferred discipline, organization, and careful control. He believed that unnecessary violence attracted police attention, and attention was something he wanted to avoid at all costs. Instead of loud displays of power, Gambino built an empire that operated quietly but efficiently across New York City. Throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, the Gambino family grew into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. At its height, the family was believed to have more than 500 made members, fully initiated mafia soldiers who had sworn loyalty to the organization and its code of secrecy. But the true strength of the family extended far beyond those official members. Behind them stood thousands of associates, businessmen, union leaders, street criminals, and political contacts who worked with the mafia without formally being part of it. These associates helped the family expand its influence into legitimate industries while quietly supporting its illegal operations. Under Gambino's leadership, the organization became deeply embedded in the economic life of New York. One of its most profitable activities was racketeering. Racketeering involved controlling businesses and forcing them to pay for protection. Companies that cooperated with the mafia were allowed to operate smoothly. Those who refused often faced threats, vandalism, or worse. Another major source of income was illegal gambling. From underground card games to sports betting operations, the Gambino family managed a vast network of gambling businesses that generated enormous profits. These operations ran quietly across neighborhoods, often hidden behind legitimate storefronts or private clubs. The mafia also gained enormous power through labor unions. By influencing union leadership, the Gambino family could control entire industries. They could decide which companies received contracts, which workers were hired, and which construction projects moved forward. This level of influence allowed the mafia to collect money from businesses that depended on union cooperation. One industry where this control became particularly valuable was construction. New York was constantly expanding, with new buildings, roads, and infrastructure projects appearing throughout the city. By manipulating union contracts and construction companies, the Gambino family was able to profit from many of these projects. Another common mafia operation was loan sharking. Through loan sharking, the family provided high-interest loans to gamblers, struggling businesses, and individuals who could not obtain money from traditional banks. These loans came with extremely high interest rates, and failure to repay them often resulted in intimidation or violence. Together, these operations created a steady and powerful stream of income. But what truly set Carlo Gambino apart from many other mafia bosses was the way he managed this vast organization. He avoided flashy lifestyles. He rarely appeared in the media, and he stayed far away from crimes that attracted national attention. While other gangsters built reputations through violence and publicity, Gambino ruled from the shadows, quietly overseeing one of the most powerful criminal networks in America. By the 1960s, the Gambino crime family had become a dominant force in organized crime, and at the center of it all stood a man who had once arrived in New York as a poor immigrant from Sicily. Carlo Gambino had now become one of the most powerful figures in the American Mafia. By the 1960s, Carlo Gambino had firmly established himself as one of the most powerful figures in the American Mafia. But unlike many mob bosses who ruled through intimidation, public reputation, or dramatic displays of wealth, Gambino followed a very different path. He believed that the greatest form of power was invisibility. In a world where many gangsters sought attention, Gambino carefully avoided it. He rarely gave interviews, never spoke publicly about his operations, and made sure his name stayed out of newspaper headlines whenever possible. This quiet approach earned him a nickname within the criminal underworld, the Quiet Don. For Gambino, staying out of the spotlight was not just a personal preference, it was a strategy, one that helped him maintain power while avoiding the growing attention of federal investigators. At the time, law enforcement agencies in the United States were beginning to focus more aggressively on organized crime. The FBI and other authorities were slowly building cases against mafia leaders across the country. Many mob bosses made the mistake of attracting attention. They drove expensive cars, lived in extravagant mansions, and surrounded themselves with luxury and publicity. Their lifestyles made them easy targets for investigators and journalists. Carlo Gambino refused to live that way. Instead, he maintained a surprisingly modest appearance. He often dressed simply, avoided flashy jewelry, and lived quietly with his family in a modest home in Brooklyn. To outsiders, he appeared more like a quiet neighborhood businessman than the leader of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. But behind this modest image was a man who carefully controlled a vast and complex empire. Gambino followed a strict set of personal rules that helped him protect both himself and his organization. The first rule was simple: never attract unnecessary attention. This meant avoiding public displays of wealth or behavior that might draw the interest of law enforcement. By blending into ordinary life, Gambino made it far more difficult for authorities to build cases against him. His second rule was to stay away from the media. He rarely appeared in photographs, and when he did, he kept his distance from reporters and cameras. Another rule Gambino strongly enforced was avoiding the drug trade. While some crime families were becoming involved in narcotics trafficking, Gambino believed that drug crimes attracted too much attention from law enforcement. Drug investigations often involved undercover agents, federal task forces, and long prison sentences. Gambino wanted none of that. Instead, he focused on traditional mafia businesses such as gambling, labor racketeering, and loan sharking, operations that were profitable but less likely to bring intense federal scrutiny. Perhaps most importantly, Gambino believed that violence should be used carefully and quietly. The mafia had always relied on violence to enforce loyalty and eliminate threats, but Gambino understood that reckless killings could trigger massive police investigations. Under his leadership, violence was controlled and strategic. When action was necessary, it was handled discreetly, often far from public attention. This disciplined approach allowed Gambino to maintain stability within his organization while keeping law enforcement at a distance. Over time, his leadership style proved remarkably effective. While other mafia bosses were arrested, imprisoned, or assassinated, Carlo Gambino continued to operate quietly behind the scenes. His influence stretched across unions, businesses, and criminal networks throughout New York. He rarely needed to appear in public to prove his authority. Everyone in the underworld already knew who was in control. From the outside, Carlo Gambino appeared to be an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But in reality, the quiet Sicilian immigrant had become one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history, a man who ruled the mafia not with noise or spectacle, but from the shadows. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino had spent nearly 2 decades at the top of the mafia hierarchy. During that time, he had successfully built one of the most powerful and stable crime families in the United States. Unlike many mob leaders before him, Gambino had managed to avoid prison, major scandals, and violent internal wars. But as he grew older, one important question began to loom over the future of the organization. Who would lead the family after him? In the mafia world, succession was always a delicate matter. Choosing the wrong successor could fracture a crime family, spark violent rivalries, or invite challenges from ambitious members within the ranks. Gambino understood that maintaining stability after his death would be crucial. Rather than selecting a leader known for violence or street power, Gambino made a decision that reflected his own leadership style. He chose a man who was disciplined, intelligent, and deeply involved in the family's business operations. That man was Paul Castellano. Castellano was not a typical mafia boss. Unlike many gangsters who had built reputations through street violence, Castellano was known more for his business skills. He had extensive experience managing the family's financial interests and had developed strong connections within legitimate industries. In particular, Castellano had significant influence in the construction business and various labor unions, areas that generated enormous profits for the mafia. But Castellano's selection was not based solely on business ability. He also had a personal connection to Gambino. Paul Castellano was Gambino's brother-in-law, having married Gambino's sister many years earlier. This family relationship strengthened the trust between the two men and made Castellano a natural choice in Gambino's eyes. When Gambino formally named Castellano as his successor, it signaled a clear message about the future direction of the crime family. The organization would continue to prioritize business, stability, and quiet influence rather than reckless violence. However, not everyone within the family agreed with this decision. Many members of the Gambino crime family came from the street-level side of organized crime. These were men who had built their reputations through robberies, loan sharking, and enforcement work. They respected bosses who had risen through the same dangerous world. To them, Castellano seemed different. He was seen by some as distant, overly focused on business dealings, and disconnected from the street soldiers who carried out much of the family's day-to-day operations. This quiet dissatisfaction would slowly grow inside the organization. At first, these tensions remained beneath the surface. Carlo Gambino was still alive, and his authority was unquestioned. Few people within the family were willing to openly challenge his decision, but the seeds of conflict had already been planted. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, Paul Castellano officially took control of the crime family. In the years that followed, the division between the business-oriented leadership and the street-level faction of the family continued to widen. Among those watching these developments carefully was a rising gangster from Queens, a man who believed the family needed a different kind of leader. His name was John Gotti, and before long, his challenge to Castellano would ignite one of the most dramatic power struggles in mafia history. By the mid-1970s, Carlo Gambino had become one of the most powerful and respected figures in the entire American Mafia. For nearly 20 years, he had quietly controlled one of New York's largest crime families, overseeing an empire that stretched across industries, unions, and criminal networks throughout the city. But unlike many mafia bosses before him, Gambino's reign had been remarkably stable. There had been no dramatic public battles for power, no flashy displays of wealth, no constant headlines linking his name to violence. Instead, Gambino ruled with patience, discipline, and caution. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at the age of 74. He passed away peacefully in his home in Massapequa, New York, surrounded by family members. For a man who had spent decades at the center of organized crime, his death was surprisingly quiet. And in many ways, that quiet ending reflected the way he had lived his life. The history of the American Mafia is filled with stories of bosses who met violent ends. Many were assassinated by rivals, betrayed by their own associates, or eventually imprisoned after years of investigation by federal authorities. But Carlo Gambino's story was different. Despite leading one of the most powerful crime families in the country, he was never assassinated. No rivals successfully challenged his position while he was alive. He also never spent a long period in prison, avoiding the kind of convictions that brought down many other mob leaders during the same era. And perhaps most remarkably, he died peacefully in his own home rather than in a prison cell or on the streets. His leadership style had allowed him to survive in a world where survival was often short-lived. Gambino understood something many other gangsters failed to realize. In the world of organized crime, power did not always belong to the loudest or the most violent leader. Sometimes it belonged to the man who stayed quiet, who watched carefully, and who moved only when the moment was right. In the violent history of the American Mafia, Carlo Gambino proved something unusual. Sometimes the most powerful criminals are the ones who stay the quietest,